Good morning, everybody. I'm a multilingual scholar, so I might switch a bit. So I'm warning the Dutch ears in advance. Um, my name is Susan Kutse van Rooij, and I'm the current director of Het Zuid-Afrikahuis. And Margriet allowed me a brief moment to make a few remarks before we start our sessions focused on thinking South Africa forward otherwise. And I want to focus on the concepts imagination and repair. Uh, I want to share a few lived experiences with you around those two terms. So I'm a South African, also returning to South Africa when I go on pension. In 1995, now put you in that historical space. So 27 April 1994, we voted for the first time in a free election. 1995, I'm a young academic lecturer at Waal Triangle Technikon. Those of you who do not know South Africa, it's the ugliest place on earth. It is industrial, it's smoggy, Sasol is close by, but that's where I'm called to teach. Um, and it was a really exciting and historic moment for higher education institutions in South Africa. We had to merge institutions. All of a sudden, there were, or not all of a sudden, over time, in one place like Pretoria, there would be 6 or 7 institutions of higher education, one for black students, one for white students, etc., etc. So now we're moving into the new South Africa, and we want to create South African institutions. So I was privileged in the mid 90s to be a young academic lecturer, very naive, which is fantastic because you are courageous when you are naive. And at that time, I was tasked at Valtech to lead the commission for the transformation of the language policy. Now, what was the policy up until that stage? It was a bilingual, dual medium Afrikaans English policy. There were about 1,000 students, mostly Afrikaans speaking. So in every lecture, there would be 50% of the time Afrikaans lecturing and 50% English. Overnight, our student population transformed. And we sit with Sharpeville, Sebokeng, Bopilong, Boipatong close in our region. And fantastic, all these students had opportunities to come to university for the first time. So obviously, our language policy was not doing its job anymore. And it was my privilege to steer a commission to transform that language policy. So we did the right thing. We had consultations with all stakeholders. That included parents, students, lecturers, academic staff, people in the community. And I'm a multilingualism scholar. So right from the start, I advocate for adding Sesotho to the policy. Sesotho is the most dominant language spoken in the region. So I said, let's have English, but also Sesotho. And I'm resisted right from the start. So students they just ignore me. Sorry, prof, no, not gonna happen. And then they move on. So we end up after a period of 6 months of consultation with an English only policy. I am a Democrat. I listen to the will of the people. People have spoken. We will have an English policy. That's good. So, one last step I wanted to perform was to get Neville Alexander to evaluate the policy. Those of you who know Neville Alexander is possibly the best scholar on earth, or was until he passed, in multilingualism and education. Naivety of the youth, arrogance of the youth. I phone his office and I say, hello, I'm Susan. I'm from the Waal, which everybody knows is ugly. Nobody wants to come there. Could you please come and evaluate our policy process? Because I want to put something in front of Senate that is solid, high quality, and that we can accept with confidence. Bless his soul, Neville says, yes, he'll come. It's July. It's smog everywhere. It's a horrible situation, weather-wise, climate-wise. Neville arrives. He goes through, he checks our processes. So he says to me, Sue, bring me a selection, a sample of all the stakeholders you spoke with in your commission. So I bring some parents, some council members, academics, and Prof. Neville interviews all of them again. At the end of the 2 days, he looks at me and he says, Sue, I can guarantee that this is a solid, high quality policy that answers to the needs of the people in this institution now. Right at the end, he says to me, are there any questions or comments that I want to make? And I'm in the room with Mr. Multilingualism. So I say, Prof. Neville, I've tried to get Sesotho on the policy, but I was resisted every step of the way. Why? And then he says these profound words to me. He looks at me and he says, Susan, our people cannot even imagine it. Because of colonization and because of apartheid, people cannot even imagine that our languages can carry us through higher education, can be of an advantage cognitively. I want to skip 30 years. Then I've been involved in policy writing, higher education. Today, every university in South Africa has a multilingual policy. It's not a thing of beauty. It does not treat languages equally. There is a lot of unevenness in the system. But it took 30 years for people to start to imagine. And I want to close with the words of a student that I interviewed at Northwest. We were making concept videos in Sesotho for the Faculty of Economics on important concepts like interest, for example. And these videos were made by young lecturers, and they were in Sesotho. And I asked the students, do you think these concept videos will help as additional material for learning? And this student said, I think these concept videos will be useful because some students are from rural areas where English, they do it as a subject, or other subject teachers, or on the other subjects, he says, teachers explain in their language to make sure that they understand. We know that the vernacular is smuggled into the classroom all the time. So there's no person who goes to a township school who has gone through English education. That doesn't happen. It's code switching the whole time. But then he says these profound words to me. He says, some students, it's not like they are stupid. The language is the problem. So what we as multilingual experts know over time, these students, it took us 30 years as a community to get there. So back to imagination, back to what we are doing today. So I think this message from the lived experience of a South African and of South African students is that the journey to change the imagination of South African students and staff about the use of indigenous languages for success in higher education, it seems to be a sacred journey. And sacred journeys are long journeys. Think of the Camino. It's a long walk. Before it was accepted, and only accepted in some forms. It wasn't a one form fits all. It's a messy implementation process. So I want to conclude by saying I hold high expectations for every session here today, because every piece of imagination that you can rise to the fore or ideas about reimagining and repair, I will really hope that we can go into exchange situations where we can have more South Africans in the conversation as well, and we can share our thinking about reimagining South Africa. It is still a process that is in process, and maybe it's a good thing. You don't change 300 years of colonization in 30 years. The thinking, the collective memory and pain of people cannot be changed in that way. With those few words, I want to conclude and I want to welcome every presenter today. Remember my high expectations, and I want to thank you for giving you our time, for you giving us your time, your wisdom, your energy. To me, as a South African, it's amazing to think that there's a group of people somewhere in the town of Amsterdam who wants to think with us. That is an amazing thing in my mind. So thank you for that. I want to thank Margriet and Prof. Yves Jude. They are our chairs, academics in the house. Margriet, thank you for imagining the symposium. We are very proud of you, and it's always fun to work with you. Um, yeah, well, not only your ideas, but it manifested. And that's the jump I want to think about today: imagination and manifestation. Um, I also want to thank my colleagues. We are a small team. They are there at the back. Vessel, you anchored this. Megan, you did a lot. Rosalie, you did a lot. And our other colleagues will help today. Tara started with us to imagine this event. Thank you so much. What an honor and a privilege to work with you. Um, so I hold our small team in high regard. With these few words, I declare our symposium open with high expectations.
Thanks very much, Susan, for these very challenging words. The level has been set high. It's also my privilege this morning to welcome all of you very warmly to het Zuid-Afrikahuis, to Amsterdam. Some of you have traveled very far recently, some of you have traveled a little bit less long. Some were kept from traveling at all, and we're very sorry that they are not able to join us here today due to circumstances. But to everyone who's here and perhaps a few online in the live stream, a very warm word of welcome. It was a very conscious decision on my part to host the conference this year, or the symposium that the chair offers, here at the Zuid-Afrikahuis rather than at one of the UFA buildings or conference rooms or collegezalen. It's a historical site whose own past is part of what we are here to think about, and about which we will hear more shortly from Rosalie, who's sitting there at the back. She's head of the library and archives of this building. And also from Peter, whose paper will delve more into some specificities of the house. But to me, a site like this building really invites us, not without complications, it's not an easy invitation, to convene a conversation about the future or futures, that of the house and of its organizations, but also as a thematic focus on South Africa, the work that is being done here in the house, and of the transnational relations that the house and the institutions housed in this building upholds. And the work it does here in the local context as part of this weird, strange canal district, of the city with all of its different social tensions, the country with its complicated public debates, and of course, more broadly, set in Europe itself. There's certainly no shortage of reasons to reflect together on South Africa's future, as has been many times before already, by taking stock of its present. I don't have to tell you about this. So I'll skip some of what I was going to say. And I also think that you don't need to be a South African to recognize that many of the things we are worried about in terms of South Africa are also, in fact, happening all over the world at the moment. Everywhere it seems that we are living through what really feels like a mounting global crisis, deepening inequalities, ecological collapse, rising geopolitical tensions, bombs dropping everywhere as we speak. And South Africa is, just as the Netherlands are, not isolated or insulated from any of these events. And the current order is under enormous strain. We feel it everywhere. steeped as we are both in spectacular and slower forms of violence and injustice. So the future doesn't only feel insecure, but very bleak in many ways. We are not futurists, I think. We are scholars of culture and of the social. We are historians and cultural practitioners and represent many other disciplines and professions in between. What we bring to these questions is different from what a policy analyst or a scenario planner brings. And I think this is worth saying out loud and exploring today to what those differences might be. And I'm really happy, Susanne, that you so effectively already dropped this notion of the imagination in our midst. Because let's start with the obvious. What literature, art, historicizing, the work that historians do, and cultural practices do, and what the work gathered in the Symposium does, is to investigate, as scholars and practitioners, the dreams, the desires, but also the fears through which communities orient themselves in the present in order to take a direction for the future. This directing within the present towards the future has always been the case. Humans have been doing this. It's not something that is modern or of our own recent times. In colonial times, imaginaries of the future were grounded in visions of a shared ethnicity and culture. Think of this very problematic stamverwantschap notion, for example, in our case here in this house specifically, shaping what kinds of futures were conceivable and for whom, and that were put to work in the service of exclusion and domination by fixing identities as static, fixing some identities in a hierarchy, or fixing identities in a hierarchy with some as civilized and others as primitive, and a future largely dependent on the benevolence of Western culture. Resistance to that fixing and reification of identities and social subjectivity from the beginning involved reasserting indigenous knowledge, indigenous temporalities, indigenous ways of imagining the future as living and valid. Contemporary Afrofuturism, indigenous knowledge frameworks, African perspectives that begin from elsewhere to Western epistemologies. And I would say also this happens elsewhere too, in Latin America, in parts of India, also in our own European context. So it's a challenge to Western paradigms, I would say, in many different forms, are all aligned in a tradition of resistance and operating today in a significantly changed field of power. But these poles are not connected in a simplistic manner through time only back then and now, nor is the shift clean and complete. That is what we had, and this is what we now have. What we find, this is why this house is so fascinating, in the archive and in contemporary culture alike, is entanglement of older imaginaries persisting or appearing inside newer ones, colonial frameworks resurfacing in post-colonial forms, and alternative futures being built partly from and partly against earlier material and immaterial input. Even though we attempt to move beyond that which we are trying to change or alter, we remain in many ways attached to it. So what interests me about the work that is gathered here today and which we will hear about is the way the creative imagination, there it is, and our hermeneutic capacity, our ability to make sense of our world, operate on two levels simultaneously. On the one hand, art and culture is the primary medium through which we share through which the shared imaginaries take shape. Welcome. Come in and take a seat, please. Yes, great to have you here, Karen and Michael. Yeah. It's the stories, the images, the sounds, and the forms through which communities articulate who they are, where they come from, and where they're heading to. In doing so, they attach feeling to ideas. They make the nation, post-apartheid, the post-colonial, the neo-national, Fortress Europe, not only thinkable, but livable and emotionally inhabitable. These are not only analytical categories, but effective structures sticky with accumulated feeling and creative works that interrogate them, become themselves part of and is often absorbed back into these very myths that they examine. But art and culture does something else too, and that is what Neville Alexander's words really illustrate to us, and that is where the radical political and imaginative force lies of what we do and study. It's not only the means through which existing imaginaries are expressed and reproduced, but it's also the tools we use to generate new ideas and ways of thinking. Creative imagination has the capacity to picture social relations not as they are, but as they might be or could be, to propose something imaginable beyond the conventional and the dominant, however tentative this may be. And this might be in the form of something that we don't want to have, so it sort of steers us away as a warning sign, or it might imagine something that we would like to have, and so that then is the direction that we'll head to. I want to quickly say something about a project we are doing, because this capacity to imagine otherwise is to render alternatives sensible and feelable, to make them tangible. And it's precisely what makes culture indispensable to any serious thinking about the future. It's not just a left-wing, grachtengordel elite, Chardonnay sipping kind of endeavor. Sometimes it also is, but not only. And I would suggest a very important part of our agenda today. So I would like to share with you then a QR code. You can use it. I will also share it with you later. It's a code for a call for papers that we have recently launched. Vincent Kuitenbrouwer at the back there, the historian at the UvA, and François Jansen van Rensburg from the Wereldmuseum, and myself. And it's a call for a contribution to a series of publications. It will become part of this series. Here are the books themselves. Look. In this series, the collection of the Zuid-Afrikahuis is taken as a point of departure to investigate the historical entanglements between South Africa and the Netherlands, as well as Europe more broadly. And the aim is to open our understandings of these entanglements to new perspectives, to find new ways of understanding that relationship, also to find new ways and new voices and new stories to those historical moments. The call itself focuses on traveling in South Africa by looking at travel logs and other traveling objects, and asks for essayistic, critically reflective contributions. For time's sake, I'm not going to say much more about this, but I just wanted to drop this here. I think Rosalie will maybe also say something about this. So note the dates. The deadline for submissions of an abstract is 31 August. I hope that many of you would feel inspired to send us something, especially after you've seen what the collection here holds. And the first drafts of the papers need to be finished by 31 January. So there's really ample time. We have lots of weeks and months to write something. It's never enough. Huh? You should have heard my cynical laugh this morning when I wrote this down. So here's the QR code once more. Okay, but let's return to today. As you will see, many of the presentations is about the past. We're also focusing a lot on the archive. There's a lot of work on heritage, although we are directing ourselves to the future, and this might feel like a kind of paradox. But of course, it's not really. The past is a reservoir of lived futures. Every historical moment contains future visions that were imagined or potentially put down, but not necessarily realized, foreclosed hopes, paths not taken, visions suppressed. This is really part of the work that a collection like those that are circulating here tries to uncover. So heritage work at its most critical is not about conserving what was, but about recovering what could have been, what futures were foreclosed, and which of these remain available to us, and what to do with that. Heritage in that sense is also a technology of the future. When we preserve, commemorate, and narrate the past, we don't do it for its own sake, but also always to give communities or collectives an identity, a sense of continuity. And to have a say in heritage is therefore really to have a say in the future, the direction that one can take as a collective or as a member of that collective. And thirdly, the notion of repair, which is contained in this critical investigation of the heritage that we deal with here is itself a notion that carries that paradox, because you can't repair something that hasn't been damaged in some way, so that's already an action in the past, but the act is oriented towards the future in which the damage has been addressed. So there is a kind of a sense of time in that. So repair is not to pretend that the past didn't happen, but to insist that the consequences are not inevitable, that there can be something done to that damage. So all of these dimensions are contained in today's keywords: entanglement, imagination, and repair and care. So let's go to the program because we're running behind already. We'll start with a presentation by Rosalie to give us a bit of context of where we are, in fact. Some of you I know are old and familiar visitors to the house. Some are new, I think. And it might be interesting or we thought it would be interesting to have a brief introduction of some of the collections that are held here. So Rosalie, who is head of the library and archive, will tell us briefly about the collection. There's a possibility to walk with Rosalie and Vincent through the house and its collections at lunch. So at 1 o'clock, if you're interested, you can convene outside of this room in the hallway where we go up to the stairs to the library. And if the groups are too big, they will do this again at the end of the day when we close with a drink. Then they'll start first with another round of tours through the house. So don't worry, everyone can get a turn. And it's nice to do this in small groups because then at least there's possibility for interaction. Then we'll move on to two papers in the plenary session. Tolitemba, unfortunately, wasn't able to travel from Groningen to Amsterdam. And it's really sad to have him not with us. And we send him all our love today. Tolitemba, I don't know if you are watching, but lots of love from this room. Peter will start after Rosalie, a PhD candidate from Maastricht University. And after him, Sinead Barnabas will take the floor. She's from the University of Groningen and Saatchi Chair in South African Art and Visual Culture at the University of Johannesburg. After their papers, we'll have time for some questions and reflection. Then there will be lunch at the back in the front part of the house. That sounds like a contradiction, but I mean to your back. Then there will be the tour. Then we will break out in plenary, in breakout rooms, because we are too many to have all of the papers presented in plenary fashion today. Some will stay here. Some will go to the bestuurskamer, the room at the top at that part of the house, and some will go to the library. We'll put up this is very small, but it's also on the program in your hands. And those who are not presenting papers are welcome to join any of these three sessions. So you are very welcome to pick and choose which of the themes and topics you'd like to attend. For now, and then after that, we'll convene plenary again. I would very much like to ask the groups to briefly tell us what you spoke about so that we have a sense of what was discussed in the different plenary rooms, because we are not all able to be there, all of us. And then we'll close off with a few more presentations, but I'll say more about that when we get there. So before I really stop, a big word of thank you first to the whole team in this building. Susan, thank you very much for hosting us here today. Wessel, thank you very much. You're the person behind the camera, so to speak, and doing all the technical stuff. Rosalie, for all your support and for talking us through the collection here. Megan, for all the help and for taking photos. And Sabine and Josefa, I don't know if they are here today, but who also provided support. You all worked very hard to make today possible, and will continue in the background with all kinds of work throughout the day. And thanks also for your support of the work the chair does. I really appreciate it tremendously. Okay, once we are done with the plenary presentations, there will be time to ask questions or to reflect. Please don't speak unless you have the microphone in your hand, because people in the live stream will not be able to hear you unless you have the microphone in your hand. Even if you can speak loud enough for everyone in this room to hear you, there's a technical reason for using the microphone. So please don't forget that. And I really need to stop now because I promised to stick to the program, time indications as much as possible, and I'm already not doing that. So enjoy the day.
Yeah. Hey.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you again for being here today. My name is Rosalie Dols, and yeah, I'm head of the Library and Archive Department. I'm responsible for the conservation and management of the collections, as well as for shaping future collection policy and strategy. In this presentation, I would like to tell you briefly about the origins of the collection and the context and spirit in which it was founded, the collection in the house, which we now preserve, the things we do and would like to do with the collection. Yeah, Belgium. Okay. Well, the collection of the Zuid-Afrikahuis is shaped by several organizations. I will give you a brief summary of a few of these organizations. From 1923 onwards, this building was acquired by the ZASM, the ZASM, the South African Motherland Foundation. The ZASM itself emerged from an earlier organization, the NZASM, the Dutch South African Railway Association company. This organization was founded under the presidency of Paul Kruger, and the company was financed largely through Dutch and German private investments. The railway line was connecting Pretoria with the Lago Bay, the Maputo. And in the 1900s, this railway was confiscated by the Brits during the Second South African War. Many years later, in 1909, the Dutch investors received compensation payments. And with this money that was left, the group started a new organization, and that was the ZISM, the South African Motherland Foundation. Another important organization for the foundings of the collection was the NZAV, the Dutch South African Foundation, founded in 1881. This was a lobby network that strongly supported the Boer cause. According to the NZAV, the Boers form part of the Dutch cultural heritage. The NZAV promoted a racially exclusive vision of shared heritage in which the Boers were claimed as part of the Dutch cultural identity. In this narrative, VOC settlers were cast as the forefathers of the Boers. This framing erases the indigenous people and descendants of enslaved populations, who are also part and parcel of that Dutch colonial history. Well, this lobby group, this network, NZAV, was focused on Dutch Afrikaner kinship, stamverwantschap, where Peter will tell us more about. We're focused on this shared ancestry, language, and heritage, focused on white settler identity, and cultural and political solidarity. Well, in this spirit, they organized lectures, collected books, and created a library. And then there was another organization, the South African Loan Fund, the Voorschotkas. This was another entity involved in improving and financing migration towards South Africa. Well, alongside the collection of the NZAV, there was also the collection of the South African Institute. And the South African Institute, the SIE, was established in 1939 and as a library and documentation center, supporting the chair of Afrikaans language and literature at the municipal university, so nowadays the University of Amsterdam. Well, in the 1950s, the collection of the South African Institute was brought together with the NZAV collection in this building. Well, there were many more organizations, but I will not tell you about everything. But all these organizations came together in 2006 and 16, and well, we are now the Zuid-Afrikahuis Amsterdam. Okay, well, The organizations housed in this building, they didn't take a formal public position against apartheid. This silence was seen by many as expressing some kind of support of the regime and the policies of apartheid. As a result, the building also became a site of protest, where anti-apartheid activists and demonstrators regularly gathered the voice of their opposition. Okay. Okay, what do we preserve in the house? Well, we have an archive, and this archive contains the organization archives of all these several organizations which I just mentioned. Not only corporate archives, but also personal archives of people who are part of these long-standing organizations. We do not actively acquire archival material, although new items occasionally enter the collection through donations, gifts, or special events. Yes, then we have an image database. This collection is actually part of the archive, but we preserve the pictures separately in the image database. This mainly consists pictures of the Boerenrepublieken, Transvaal en Oranje Vrijstaat, in the period of 1880 till 1910. Alongside these pictures, the collection also contains postcards, maps, and lantern slides. The library collection, in contrast of the archive, is a more dynamic part of the collection. We still actively develop this collection through ongoing acquisition. It includes a wide range of material, from academic publications and scholarly works to novels, literature, poetry, and art books. These publications help to broaden the dialogue surrounding the collection and complement the archive by introducing perspectives, voices, and experiences that that may otherwise be absent from the archival records. And then we have the artifacts. These several organizations which were housed in the building collected quite a few artifacts. Like paintings, sculptures, photographs, boeren memorabilia, which were once all on the walls or presented in the house. Well, all these objects are now stored in the depot, in the basement. We are now figuring out, together with Peter, we did some sessions. We're figuring out what to do with these objects. Maybe display some of them in a permanent exhibition. Maybe some other objects need a new home or needs to be brought back to South Africa. Well, this is a big project, you can imagine. Okay. And then when we think about the future of the collections, of the house and the collections, in terms of digital access, diverse voices, and critical reflection, we have some things done and would like to do more of these developments. Linked data, for example. The archive, which I told you about, is about a specific period, specific time frame. A lot of voices are absent. How can we connect these migration stories, what we have here in the house, to other narratives, other collections in the Netherlands, for example? For example, the collection of the IISG, the International Institute of Social History, or collections of the National Archive, or maybe in the future to collections in South Africa. The last year, we made the archive technical ready to join on linked data platforms. Through linked data, our collection becomes connected to other heritage collections, enabling researchers to discover related materials beyond the boundaries of a single institution. And then we have the exhibitions. For example, in the beginning of the year, we had a book exhibition together with the Wereldmuseum in Leiden, their book collection. The main subject was traveling, in a sense of colonial travels, inner journeys, and forced migration. This way of working with books as an object gives opportunities to share some insights of our book collection and critical reflect which voices are missing and which themes are having more focus than others and why. Yeah, and then the publications. Margriet already told us about it. Well, it's another way of reflecting and enriching the collection. These two publications were initiated by Margriet in 2022 and 2024. Yeah, they're both great examples of giving a decolonized view on archive materials, artifacts, lantern slides, and pictures. And through these initiatives, we seek to engage critically with histories and voices that have often remained underrepresented. Well, in fact, we have this new call of papers. So please take a look at that. And yeah, that was it for now. We have a guided tour, as Margriet already told you about, at 1 and maybe also at the end of the day. And yeah, if you want, you can join us and I will tell you some more about the collection, about what we do here. This is just a part of what we're doing here. So yeah, so feel free to join.
Je kan hier zelf klikken, toch? Ja, dat is zal die vast. Oké. Staat die vast, jullie? Ja, even oppassen. Dit is hem, hè? Ja. Okay, hopefully you can see this, but we'll get there. So I know there's a literal ossiva in the room, but maybe let's trust the process. Okay. So thank you, Margriet, for organizing this and inviting me, and also to the Zuid-Afrikahuis and yeah, to everyone being present here today. I will try not to. I always go over time, so I will rely on Margriet to tell me, and then I will speed up. But yeah, and also I before I talk, maybe it's also thank you to the Zuid-Afrikahuis for really being open about sharing the work that I do and critically reflecting on the institution. Yeah, and I'm curious to hear what all of you think about it. And yeah, let's go for it. So my name is Peter du Plessis. I'm a PhD candidate at Maastricht University, and I'm working on a critical institutional history of the Zuid-Afrikahuis here on the Keizersgracht in Amsterdam. The building, the network of organizations that produced it, and the longer history of how Dutch whiteness has been shaped through its relationship with Afrikaner forms of whiteness from the 1880s through to the 1990s. And my way into that history is through objects, archives, spaces, and the people who passed through them. And today I want to make a case to you in the next 20 minutes or so that the Zuid-Afrikahuis is worth attending to at a symposium like this, not because it is uniquely important, but because it is a particularly legible site at which to see how futures have been made in cultural and intellectual practice on the Dutch side of the Netherlands-South African relationship. The futures it has helped to make have not been incidental. They have been built into its objects, its building, into the academic chairs that it has produced, its knowledge infrastructures it's set up to make South Africa knowable to Dutch audiences since 1923. To take the symposium's question seriously, how futures are narrated, contested, and reimagined is, I think, to take seriously what institutions like this one have been doing and what they can become. The way I want to make that case today is through, if I can find the pijltje, I'll say, through a collage. Throughout my PhD, I've made a number of these, layering archival material with other images, with my own photographs, with things I've written. I do this because it helps me see what I'm writing about. Collages are tools of interpretation for me. They let me put things next to each other that the archive does not put next to each other, and then ask, what do they do together? So before we go further onto the collage on the screen, I want to address the literal osava or ox wagon in the room. I first saw it a few years ago on display in this building. It connected immediately to other archival material in which the Great Trek, and I'm not going to assume everyone knows what it is, functioned as the dominant narrative of South African history, a narrative of a people claiming independence from the British, but also of white men bringing civilization to the interior. Currently, the Osava is not on display, but stored in the archive. So I brought it out today to maybe speak to it, but it's experimental. So let's see. So years before me, in 2012, two South African artists of mixed ancestry, Ronelda Kamfer and Nathan Trantral, encountered the same Osava in the same building. They've written about that encounter in Absent Presences, the book that was circulated, the 2024 publication that critically engaged with the Zuid-Afrikahuis's collections. And on the collage, you can see on the left um, a sketch by Trantral of an Afrikaner boy with a Osava at his feet. And beside it is the opening words of a poem by Kamfer, Daar is 'n donker huis. There is a dark house, full of pretenders who pretend to be deaf. Their encounter is one of confusion and alienation, recognizing the shared cultural ties and the violence on which those ties were built. Trantral and Kamfer saw and felt what they did because of where they stand. I want to be honest in the same way about where I stand. You can see in the center of the collage a golden frame with my own hand holding it. And the hand puts me in the collage and locates me in what I'm sharing. I was raised as a white Afrikaner man from Mpumalanga, now working in the Netherlands and writing this critical history of an institution that is intimately connected to my own history. I'm not standing outside of what I'm describing. And the miniature Osava in this room is not unconnected to the full-scale ones that stood on my school grounds in the early 2000s. These wagons were pedagogical. It folded myth into daily life. And the analysis I share here today is shaped by that position and by a desire to participate in a decentering of whiteness rather than its continuation under different terms. So I want us now to look at this fragment that is at the top of the collage, two men inspecting an object. The object is the same miniature ox wagon that is standing right here with us in the room today. It was built by Afrikaner students at a trade school in Vicksburg in the Orange Free State in 1938. The South African government sent it to Amsterdam that year, where it was displayed at an exhibition called the Grote Trek. These two men are inspecting it in that exhibition space. To make sense of why that exhibition was held and what that Osava was made to do, we need to situate ourselves in the 1930s. The popular Dutch, I missed a message. The popular Dutch attention to the Boer-Afrikaners that had run high at the turn of the century, expressed through feelings of stamverwantskap, the constructed sense of shared blood, language, and inheritance, had by then largely faded. But the organizations that had propagated these feelings and imaginaries of stamverwantskap in the earlier period persisted through political lobbying and elite networks aimed at shaping Dutch public opinion. And these networks were members of the NZAV and the ZSM, which Rosalie would maybe keep those acronyms, but there's a lot of acronyms and yeah. These were often prominent businessmen, academics, and politicians, among many others. And in the 1930s, in the context of rising Afrikaner nationalism, they reorganized their efforts by consolidating a knowledge infrastructure. So an academic chair in South African history, literature, and language today at the University of Amsterdam. And in practice, it was a chair in Afrikaans and Afrikaner culture. Parallel chairs in South Africa as well, a Dutch Cultural Institute in Pretoria, scholarships, and a large library collection. The Grote Trek exhibition and the Osava within it sat inside this infrastructure. 1938 was the centenary year of the Battle of Blood River, today known in South Africa as the Day of Reconciliation. The battle had taken place on 16 December 1838 between Voortrekker settlers and the Zulu army of King Dingaan. It was narrated by Afrikaner nationalism as divine deliverance and mythologized as the foundational event of Afrikaner identity. In South Africa, the 1938 centenary was the most ambitious commemoration this mythology had ever staged. 200,000 people gathered for the laying of the cornerstone of the Voortrekker monument near Pretoria. But as Sifiso Nkolisi Ndlovu has shown, the framework was not uncontested. From the late 1920s, black workers across South Africa had been mounting counter commemorations, reframing the date as the anniversary of land loss and recasting King Dingaan as an early anti-colonial resistor. The 16th of December was not a settled historical date. It was an epistemological battleground. In the Netherlands, the voorbij organizations of the Zuid-Afrikahuis, together with affiliated Flemish organizations, and yeah, today I don't go, but it's very important to keep the Flemish side because they were there. They hosted exhibitions, lectures, religious sermons, films, and the singing of songs. On the day the Grote Trek exhibition opened in Amsterdam, the vice president of the Dutch Council of State presented a formal certificate, an oorkonde, to the centenary organizers in Pretoria, signed by the leadership of every major Dutch organization in this network. The certificate declared that the Voortrekkers had carried forward, and I quote, the civilization of the white race, and that the battle of the 16th of December had confirmed, I quote again, the authority of the white race. The bonds between the Dutch and Afrikaner peoples through descent, language, and religion should be strengthened, it further continued. So this is not an analytical inference. It is literally the network speaking in its own voice. What I want to argue is that this was a transnational epistemic event and that it was actively producing a future. The Ossewa was the material anchor of that event. In fact, there was another Ossewa which is held today at the Wêreldmuseum. The South African ambassador, Dr. van Broekhuizen, which you can see here on the picture, opened the Amsterdam exhibition by describing it as a home for the Voortrekker woman and mother, and the barricade against the barbarians. The object was that made the shared history tangible for Dutch visitors. The Great Trek was romanticized. The Voortrekkers offered to Dutch viewers as kin figures whose courage they could recognize and whose history they could feel as a version of their own. The animating affect of that recognition is stamverwantskap. In 1938, the feeling was being maintained, extended, and projected forward as inheritance, at the cost of obscuring the colonial violence on which the Trek was founded. And the Ossewa has stayed here in the building since then. So I want us now to look at the upper part of the collage again. Cutting across the photograph of the two men inspecting the Ossewa, you can see another image. A black woman stands in the foreground of a centenary lager encampment in South Africa. Her hands raised on the handles of a pram, her gaze directed downward towards the white Afrikaner child seated in it. She has been dressed in period Voortrekker costume, but beneath the festive dress, if you look closely, you can see her own bracelets, the markers of a life the costume has not entirely absorbed. This image was published in the December 1938 issue of Zuid-Afrika, the magazine of the NZAV, the same network that brought the miniature Ossewa to Amsterdam. The caption reads, Mopedi bediende in feestdracht in kamp, Mopedi servant in festive dress in a camp. She's the only black person photographed in the entire issue. The textual companion to this photograph appears in the same issue in an article by Professor Bokhorst, at the time director of the Dutch Cultural Institute and holder of the ZASSM-funded chair of Dutch Cultural History in Pretoria. Bokhorst describes with what reads as cheerful ethnographic detachment, how black domestic staff were brought to rural centenary celebrations specifically, and I quote again, for the dirty work. The cooking, the cleaning, tending to children. While Afrikaners on the platteland trekked together for a weekend, they camped along the river and listened to the descriptions of Dingaan's so-called crimes. The caption names her by ethnicity here and by function. It does not give her a name. The article incorporates her presence as part of the color and the texture of the festive occasion, rather than as a person with an account of her own. The photograph's composition keeps her face turned from us. Everything the network needs from her body, her labor, and her costume, is in the image. Everything it cannot accommodate, her name, her account of the day, and her relation to the people she was working for, is absent. So I placed her where I did in the collage because she interrupts something. She interrupts the two white men in Amsterdam. They saw the Ossewa and they heard the speeches, but they did not see her. She was the silent condition of the festivities, without which they could not function. I do not know who she is, and I've not been able to recover much about her in the archive, but that is not an accident of the archive, but something the archive was built to do. Azine Magubane writes of the colonial archive in Southern Africa, and I quote, there is a wealth of information on the black image in the white mind, because that image played such a critical role in the making of the European self. The Mopedi woman appears in the Dutch archive not as subject of her own life, but as material through which an Afrikaner and Dutch white self could be made. At the center of the collage is a different photograph, a close portrait of a black woman, her face filling the frame. The photograph was, I believe, also on display at the same exhibition in Amsterdam in 1938. I first encountered it in the Zuid-Afrikahuis's image database in the physical archive. In the physical archive, the same portrait is held as two prints, each with a different caption in white ink on black paper. The first reads, Rachel Griesel, former slave, 110 years old, who took part in the Great Trek, 1938. The second reads, Griesel, cattle watcher, and stern as caretaker for the voortrekkers, still alive in 1938. Two captions and two registers, both doing the same work. One offers her as a relic, her age authenticating the trek's reach across time, the other as a serviceable old retainer, her labor authenticating its domestic order. She is offered in both as evidence, not as a subject. The most precise instrument of that operation is the name. The woman in these photographs was not Rachel Griesel. Griesel was the surname of the family who enslaved her. As a child, she had been captured somewhere in West Africa and brought to the Cape, where she was sold in the Cape Town slave market to Sarah Griesel. She was given a biblical first name, Rachel. The Griesel family took her on the trek. But around 1902, after the South African War, she settled in Vryhoek, one of the oldest black townships in Bloemfontein. She married Abraham Toka in the local Lutheran church, which today is would actually, if you go there, you should really go. It's a national heritage site and it's fascinating. By the time these photographs were captioned in 1938, she had been Rachel Toka for over 30 years. The Dutch captions know nothing of this. They preserve her as the property of a family who enslaved her and offer her to Dutch viewers in two forms the framework could absorb, relic and retainer. What neither caption can hold is the rest of her life. Very little is known about Rachel Toka in South Africa either, but during archival work there, I came across an unpublished manuscript written by one of her great-grandchildren. In February 1838, during one of the early confrontations between the Voortrekkers and the Zulus, she had saved the life of a Voortrekker child, an act for which she was respected by the Afrikaners she lived among, and which is one reason her presence is preserved in the 1938 photograph at all. In 1913, at approximately 85 years of age, she led a march of almost 500 black women through Bloemfontein against the pass laws. The march secured the release of 80 women who had been arrested. The pass laws, she said, reminded her of the passes she had been forced to carry as an enslaved person. By 1938, she was one of the most respected women in Waihoek, a leader, a midwife, and the figure to whom the women in the township and the early ANC turned for guidance. She was navigating multiple worlds at once, refusing the categories the colonial framework was trying to fix her in. None of this is in the Dutch captions, and none of this is in the Dutch archive. She died in 1940, 2 years after the photographs were taken at approximately 112 years of age. So I want to step back from the collage now. And what I've shown you is a portrait in a golden frame held by my own hand, two hands inspecting the ox wagon in this room, a black woman tending to a white child in a pram, a woman whose face fills a frame, and a sketch of a boy with an ox wagon at his feet, and also the first line of a poem, Tijdens, deze huis. The archive does not put these next to each other. I have. That is what the collage is for. What they let me see together is a cultural archive at work in Gloria Wackershane's building on the work of Edward Said. A reservoir of images, affects, and habits of perception sedimented over centuries, through which a culture knows itself. What this collage makes visible is one operation of that archive, the production of Dutch whiteness through stamverwantskap, through an imagined kinship with Afrikaner whiteness, and through the romance of the trek, and furthermore, the bodies of black women rendered as labor, as relic, and a silent condition. This is one form of the operation of coloniality, a way of organizing what counts as knowledge, who counts as a subject, and who counts as kin. I focus in my work on its epistemic mode. Gaan dit nog? Okay. So what this collage allows me to argue is that the claim sustained from the mid-20th century onward that institutions like the Zuid-Afrikahuis are politically neutral cultural and academic bodies, houses of language, literature, and scholarship, it cannot hold. These institutions are not neutrally collecting, though they were not neutrally collecting in 1938. They were producing. They were producing a Dutch white self through which who could look at an Ossewa and feel kinship, look at a black woman in a pram and see service, and look at racial toka and see a relic. The latter consolidation of that work as cultural and academic did not interrupt that production. It refined it by translating it into a register that could be felt as neutral. This is what Charles Mills calls white ignorance, not the absence of knowledge, but an organized not knowing, a knowing that does not want to know, sustained by the very institutional forms through which knowledge is uh, presented. And today, the Zuid-Afrikahuis inherits that work. So I want to close with the voice of Diana Ferris, poet, activist, and writer. In an interview shortly before her death earlier this year, she said, "Die terugroep van die geskiedenis is belangrik vir die heelmaakproses van ons land. Waar daar versoening moet geskied, moet daar eers genesing plaasvind. Herkenning en erkenning maak genesing moontlik. The recall of history, she says, is important for the work of making whole. Where reconciliation must take place, healing must come first. Recognition and acknowledgement are what make healing possible." What I've tried to show today is that the Zuid-Afrikahuis is a site at which futures have been made in objects like this one, in exhibitions like the Grote Trek, in academic chairs and infrastructures of a particular knowledge formation, and that the future made there in the 1930s was a future of shared whiteness, sustained by a framework that needed black women to appear only as labor. That framework did not stop in the 1930s. It was refined from the mid-19th century, like I mentioned already, into a register that could be felt as politically neutral. That refinement is what the institution inherits. This is the kind of work that knowledge institutions do, often without naming it as work. Cultural heritage institutions, university chairs, archives, cultural diplomatic infrastructures. These are not neutral keepers of relationships between places. They are spaces in which particular relationships are produced, publics are shaped, and particular futures rendered legible. The question the symposium is asking, to return to that, how futures are narrated, contested, and reimagined is, I think, also a question about what these spaces do and what they could become if they took their own future making seriously. For the Zuid-Afrikahuis, that means engaging with what Ferris calls terugroep, herkenning, and erkenning, recall, recognition, and acknowledgement, not as a gesture, but as a method, and as the slow work that has to come before any honest claim to reconciliation. For other institutions doing related work elsewhere, I think the question is the same, even when the objects are different. What has this space been organized around? What has it been organized to refuse? And what would it take to begin organizing it otherwise? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sinead Barnabas. My presentation today will be on the topic of heritage, communities, and the making of the past towards the making of the future. So, a little bit, I'm taking you to some examples that are different to what Peter has presented today. If we understand heritage not merely as important things from the past, but rather as the products and the processes of using the past for our contemporary means, then we see that heritage is inseparable from concepts such as identity, belonging, and power. It is deeply connected to livelihoods, to land, culture, language, and recognition. And seen through this lens, the business of heritage is very much the business of future crafting. Heritage, in all its forms, shapes access to recognition, to representation, and the ability to reclaim histories long suppressed by colonial and apartheid regimes. It reminds us that human dignity, or the withholding thereof, is not a matter of only the law or of governance, but it's lived in the stories we tell, the spaces we shape, and the people we choose to see. The field of heritage studies, which I providentially stumbled into from earlier training in cultural studies, is in the midst of experiencing a decolonial turn. But this is not new. The current debates and critical questions being asked today have come before in different form and phrasing. For example, the mid to late 1980s saw the beginnings of earnest discussion towards radically new democratized heritage landscape in South Africa. Declared the year of the Charter, 1980 marked the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Freedom Charter. The rest of the decade saw mounting opposition against the apartheid government. Both internal and external pressures forced reforms which, instead of quelling the growing unrest, gave further impetus to resistance movements. According to Siraj Rasool, the field of social history in South Africa in the 1980s was subject to the rise of democratic inclusions of history from below. Ordinary people's stories, those previously unwritten underclass experiences, emerged as counter-narrative, challenging hegemonic interpretations of the past. In the early years of democracy, heritage was repeatedly invoked, especially by politicians, as a way to help the country face the damage left by apartheid and to imagine a more humane, more equal future. In other words, politicians often turn to heritage to symbolically repair what had been broken. Lynn Meskel writes that because of this extra responsibility, rather this burden of responsibility put on heritage, the concept requires an expanded definition to include heritage as a form of social therapy, a way of putting the past to work in the service of a better future, especially for those who were harmed, who were displaced, or excluded. Indeed, the past has done some labor towards that better future, or rather, we have put it to work towards that better future. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the early Madiba Magic, the allure of the Rainbow Nation, these are all proof of that. But as we all know, heritage as therapy has not been the balm to soothe all wounds. Meskel was writing in 2008. And somewhat prophetically, she cautioned that the country's colonial history, everything that brought it to apartheid, had been glossed over. It hadn't been dealt with. Growing discontent over this, together with dashed hopes over unfulfilled promises, has largely led to decoloniality becoming such a hot topic in recent years. And we now know, we see that there's more of a serious drive, and a global one at that, to engage fully with this history and its ramifications in the present. In Decoloniality as the Future of Africa, Sabelo Ndlovu-Gansheni reminds us that decoloniality begins with recognizing the world we live in as profoundly unequal, a world shaped by colonial power structures and by education systems that still teach Africans to distrust their own histories and to admire places that continue to marginalize them. He uses strong words when he describes, quote, pedagogies and epistemologies of equilibrium that continue to produce alienated Africans that are socialized into hating Africa that produce them and liking Europe and America that reject them, end quote. This echoes Ngugi wa Thiong'o's description of the black child schooled through a Eurocentric lens, taught to look down on their own culture and knowledge. For Ndlovu Gansheni, one of the ongoing struggles in Africa is quote, a struggle to regain lost subjecthood, end quote. In other words, it is a struggle to reclaim humanity in a world that has systematically denied it. While there are pitfalls in current trends in the utilization of decoloniality, I do agree that regaining subjecthood is a pivotal struggle. Since the heritage landscape is one in which belonging, recognition, and dignity are negotiated daily, it is rich in the elements necessary for mapping out, reclaiming, and reimagining subjecthood. For communities like the Komani and the Kungenkwe San of the Northern Cape, heritage has been a purposeful and particularly useful tool through which to assert their subjecthood. After 20th century displacement from their ancestral territories in and around the Andriesvale-Askam area of the Kalahari, the Komani San finalized a land claim in 1999 that ended in a landmark settlement in which they were awarded more than 30,000 hectares of land, along with access and co-management rights within the Kalahari Transfrontier Park. The victory was a legal recognition of dispossession and also an affirmation of cultural survival. It restored access to sacred landscapes, hunting grounds, and heritage practices that had been severed for generations. What is striking about this case is that the Komani is a community formed out of diverse San groups. They are the embodiment of reimagination and repair. After being relocated to the Northern Cape in the 1990s, the Kungenkwe San arrived in a democratic South Africa carrying a complicated history. Many had served as trackers in the South African Defence Force, a role that left them politically exposed and socially mistrusted in the new dispensation. It was through a broader pan-San heritage connection that they were able to carve out a sense of belonging. At Wildebeestskale, a rock art site near Kimberley, they found a place where they could root themselves again. Even though they were not descendants of the original artists, the site became a space through which they expressed cultural continuity, reasserted indigenous identity, and rebuilt community after decades of upheaval. Their work as custodians of the Rock Art Center allowed them to reclaim narrative authority and make themselves visible in a landscape that had long marginalized San histories. And in doing so, they showed how cultural rights, dignity, and even environmental rights can be lived and enacted through everyday heritage practices. Nevertheless, these communities remain marginalized. They face challenges of unemployment, inadequate access to housing and healthcare, and food insecurity. Further to this, human rights violations have been documented in the Komani community, along with conflicts between the community and the South African national parks with regards to the implementation of their land claim in the Kalahari Transfrontier Park. So, while in these cases heritage has been leveraged towards subjecthood and accompanying rights, what heritage could not do and still cannot do is fully compensate for structural inequality and poor governance. In keeping with the idea of heritage as a site of struggle for subjecthood, I want to now bring into the conversation a personal creative piece. A song about my own familial inheritance, as a way of thinking about how stories, silences, and longings are carried across generations. I am the descendant of Indian indentured laborers in South Africa. The history of this indenture began in 1860 when the first groups of workers were brought from India to Natal as cheap labor in the sugarcane plantations. Over the next 5 decades, more than 150,000 men, women, and children arrived under contracts that promised wages, housing, and eventual return passage. Promises that were often undermined by deplorable working and living conditions, abuse, racial control, and limited freedoms. When their contracts ended, many remained in South Africa, forming communities that would become central to the social, political, and cultural life of Natal. This is the history of exploitation, resilience, and the creation of new identities in the face of colonial and later apartheid structures. The song I have written is my personal connection to this history. Shared here today, it becomes a method for reflecting on how the inherited narratives shape the futures we imagine for ourselves, yes, individually, but also how these have ripple effects that extend far beyond ourselves. Through the examples I've given here of marginalized Khoisan communities living on the periphery of society and using heritage to navigate that periphery, as well as my song, I consider how both personal and collective inheritances can constrain, can fracture, or open possibilities for living otherwise. So this song, writing it, performing it here today, is an approach to the reclaiming of subjecthood in the sense that Ndlovu Gansheni describes. It's a refusal of objectification and a declaration of presence. But I do not see it as a declaration of my presence alone. Rather, as a form of heritage work, it speaks to voice, erasure, representation, and future crafting, living in the intimate spaces of family and community. So if heritage can be a method for imagining otherwise, then we can also use it at the scale of the self. And in the case of my song, in making sense of the loose threads of diaspora, unknown ancestors, and survived trauma. Okay, so now I'm going to do something that I have not done in an academic setting before. So if my voice shakes and my fingers shake, it's because I'm trying to be very, very brave. I just need to do a sound check. So I am an intermediary guitar player, so this is not about performance. It's about the song as method. Unsung hero, I call upon your name. Brave seeker, I'm here because you came. Willing worker, you labored each day. toiling, shackled, your dreams held at bay. For you saw a new horizon, and you saw a brand new day, and you left all that you'd ever known in faith. And though you don't know my name, your blood runs through my veins, and I am all that I am, all because you came. And I stand all because you fell, and I rest all because you toiled. I have the best, and I love all because you cried, all because you bowed, weeping all the while. I hold my head up high and I enjoy walking in the light, all because you struggled, crawling through the night. For you saw a new horizon, and you saw a brand new day, and you left all that you'd ever known in faith. And though you don't know my name, your blood runs through my veins, and I am all that I am, all because you came. So I salute you, unsung hero. I salute you, brave one. For you stood on the shore as a stranger. Many came undone, but you pressed on. You pressed on. So I will not let opportunity pass by me. Oh no, for I know all those years ago, when you sailed on the sea and you had your dream, I know also you had one for me. Thank you. Sinead, that was amazing. I can't believe that you've never done this in an examples before. Clearly, you've done it in many other founders before. Well done, really. Wow. We have a few minutes before it's time for lunch. I think everyone is also looking forward to that. But I would like to offer the floor to those who'd like to ask questions or comment maybe on what you've heard here this morning. Insights or reflections. Perhaps we can start with questions for elucidation, if you have that.
or reflections? Yes, Susan.
And it's a question to Peter, but Peter, a conversation I hope we didn't have for many more years. You are right. This house has inherited stuff, and I like the questions you are asking. What are we doing with that to try and project also another imagined future for this organization? But I think we need to be very careful to jump to what is our role in projecting something for a country. And I think we need to talk a bit more about that. If we want to help South Africa reimagine itself, where are the South Africans? Can we do it with each other? And what really is the role of an organization like this now, today, in that conversation? So as a white South African, I'm a very humble person. I know I'm on sacred ground when I do my work in South Africa. Do we have enough humility, when we also engage with these conversations? So there are two. The one is for the house and this stichting, and the other one is a broader question, maybe.
Hi. Heidi, is it okay if I let Peter speak first and then I'll give the floor to you?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that necessarily. I mean, I understand your question. I think my project in particular is trying to make sense of something that was actively producing here. I think we will lie to ourselves to think that, I mean, this was a project of a group of men predominantly that was doing things here. They were trying to help people there, very particular groups of people, but they were producing imaginaries here. And so I think, of course, a lot has changed over time. I'm not really looking into the contemporary side, so I'm not nitpicking at this and this. And I think I'm not trying to say the house is not necessarily doing whatever its aims is today. But I do think, for me at least, in recognizing the past of what this building was used to do and how it produced things, then it needs to be very careful into thinking about what it's currently doing and what it wants to do in the future, because then it cannot become a project of now we must help South Africa. South Africa can help itself, in my view. Um, so it cannot become an outreach project of some sort, but it can become a space where we critically invite South Africans in to make use of the space. And I mean, that's your project. But to think about also what is the heritage of Dutch people themselves. This is a heritage project of Dutch heritage. It's not South Africa. There might be traces of us, and I say this in a broad sense, in the archive, but this is really about something, a mirror for Dutch society. And that's what my project is focused on. But I understand your question. So, yeah.
Please
Yeah.
use the microphone.
Yeah, that's what I am looking at. Susan said the Dutch gaze for the people listening in the airwaves.
Thank you for your presentation, Peter. I just had a question about your visual practice. I was wondering if you know Aubrey de Swart. Well, I think you really should. He also deals with collage and deals with Afrikaans heritage, and also actually asks about Afrikaans masculinity through that lens as well, and uses collage from the archive as a way to do that. So I think your work has a lot of great. It has a conversation it could have with an artist like that.
For those who want to hear again, Aubrey de Swart. Thanks, Heidi. I have a question. Oh, sorry, Peter first. Yeah. Would you use the microphone, please?
I mean, maybe it's a more conversation that Sinead and I can have, but I mean, I'm actually curious because I didn't know what you were going to present. I know a bit of your work from meeting you last year at the conference. Um, and I mean, I really like how you position this kind of idea of heritage as a site of struggle for the South, right, or a broader question, and then how you use music. But maybe it's more of a personal question. I mean, today I also for the first time, and I was telling my colleague, oh, now I'm going to go speak to academics, and I'm putting a picture up there, and I'm not an artist. I'm not claiming to be. Um, but as my supervisors would tell, I just arrive there sometimes with drawings, and I'm like, yeah, this and this and this, and this is what I'm trying to say. And so I'm kind of curious for you, as an academic practicing for much longer. I mean, what did it feel for you to pitch an idea like I'm going to sing a song? And yeah, I mean, you've reflected a little bit on that thing, but actually, how did it feel for you? Because I think there is something about changing our practice as academics and making our work accessible and also allowing ourselves space for what we create, not only in the words, but whether it be through music or visual. So I'm just kind of curious a little bit about that. Like maybe if you're open to sharing a bit more.
This song is something that I wrote decades ago before I had the language of subjecthood and decoloniality and all of that stuff. This was just kind of, creative in the moment, um, thinking about these things that now I have theories for. Um, but uh, I I found that when Margriet sent the invite, it fit really well, and I thought, be brave. But it's so funny because I was really really nervous to do it because when you do your academic work, you're still nervous beforehand, but you're able to do it because that's you kind of put your life in little boxes, um, and then bringing that very personal side and reflection in made me very nervous. And then as an academic, I started theorizing that nervousness, and I was thinking about how um, so for example this concept of subjecthood, right, and as something that um, needs to be struggled over. I've not seen it in any of the readings that I've read, but I felt it here today. The nerves that come with actually manifesting subjecthood, and how that maybe I should write about that. How that plays a role in the actual stepping forward and doing the thing that we are theorizing about. So I think um, I made a choice late at night when I sent an email to Margriet, and I regretted it as soon as she sent me a very excited response saying yes, that's just the kind of thing we need. And I thought, how can I step back? These are very honest thoughts that I had in the run up to this. But I'm very glad that I've done it because it's also made me start to think about how what I've just said now, that subjecthood rather, and the fear of doing that go together, and we should be talking about that as well. That bravery is doing it anyways. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe if I make a comment on that, you're bringing in something that's really interesting. I think in some areas of academia in the humanities, we've started exploring alternative ways of writing. So not in this very boring, dry, unreadable register anymore, but experimenting more with creative writing. Some people are including visual art in their academic practice. I think we're seeing that. Of course, there's this movement of practice-based or practice-led research, which really takes it from the other side. But there is something where we try to distinguish or keep separate the visceral and the embodied and the cerebral. And this dry way of speaking, talking is a very nice way of keeping the visceral and the embodied somewhere in a cage or where it can be. But here in this house and with the histories that we are talking about, you've also referenced it, Peter, your own positionality, your own entanglement with this history, this close encounter with these ox wagons in the school terrain. We're very implicated in all of that, many of us. also with the stories and the histories held here, the archives of migrants, for example. It also concerns my own family to a certain extent. So there's also there's something then that working on these topics and in your song also that became very clear, this very close personal connection to the work that you are doing, what you are studying. And what I've heard a number of times when people speak about coming to the house in a non-academic context is the embodied reaction they have of being here. And I've heard stories of many different types of affective reactions. So really ranging across a spectrum of emotions from the very happy, positive emotions, or let me just not call them positive, but the happy emotions to the very dark, so light emotions to very dark ones. And there's not really been much exploration in the academic work, I think, of people working here with those embodied aspects of working in the house or with the house or the information of that. So it's really also, I think, we are at the cusp of, being invited to start doing that more often and to bring a different type of academic reflection into the discourse we produce here on making sense of what's happening in these efforts to really grapple with difficult pasts. I had this notion of dissonant heritage also in my head as I was listening to both of you, a past that has been understood very differently or made sense of and claimed for different communities in different ways. And we're also there in many ways at a point of, it almost seems like, okay, we really need to address this now. It can't just exist in parallel to one another. But this aspect of the visceral and the embodied is really so part of this, because we know it from people who step over the threshold of this building that there is an emotional reaction, a bodily reaction to being here. So I would also be very interested in hearing more about your own experiences in that today, or maybe in the past or in the future. Which is my little segue into telling you about the zine or the zine that we would like to produce of today. It was Peter's suggestion, and I think it's a wonderful way of creating some kind of report on today's events. He brought a lot of stuff with him, pens and paper and scissors and glue and notepads. So please feel free to leave comments in writing throughout the day. The table is just around the corner here in the voorkamer. We will also like to collect photographs and snippets from your PowerPoints, for example, to paste and map into this, whatever it will become, like a little zine. And then we'll share it with those who was here today as something that's only for us who was doing all of the hard work here today. So please contribute to that so that we have some material to use for the zine. Are there any last questions or remarks? Otherwise, we can break for lunch. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. I just want to say a few things before we go. We will start again promptly at 1:30 because there are people joining us online.